Hi, today we're going to go over shading. Now, when I think of shading, I think mostly of black and white grayscale, pencil drawings, and for this video we're going to do just that. We're going to take away color for now and just focus on value. I hope that learning will be easier this way when we just focus on one thing at a time. Now, one misconception that people have is that shading is just a mindless act. If you're going to take anything away from this video, it would be that shading is something that requires intentional thought. You gotta turn on your brain. So this is going to be a bit of a long video, and I'm going to divide it up into two parts. For the first part, we're going to go over the basics of lighting and why shading requires our brain. We'll go over a character shaded in two different styles and cover presets, tone curves, and adjustment layers in Clip Studio Paint. The second part, we'll go over landscapes and study basic atmospheric perspective. We will cover tips using Clip Studio Paint's gradient tool and layer mask to make shading landscapes easier. Timestamps will be listed in the description below. Okay, so let's start with some basic background knowledge. Shading to me is just putting down value in an intentional way. And it doesn't matter if you're using a line with a pencil tool, a brush tool, using shapes, a lasso tool, or any other tool. And a lot of the time, our intention when we're shading is to show 3D form. In order to do this accurately, we need to know a little bit about lighting. So we won't go too in-depth at all, just starting with the most basics of basics, something even a kindergarten kid could understand. And it's this. When we do any shading, we need to know our lights are lighter than our shadows. Sounds obvious, but I'll show you an example later on where, I messed this up. So maybe I should consider going back to kindergarten. Here I split up my values into just three, average light, halftone, and average shadow. And here's a big dividing line here between light and shadow. So you can see halftone is on the light side. Halftone, by the way, is just when your form is turning away from the light. It's not directly facing the light. Now I know what you're thinking. What about highlights, ambient occlusion, reflected light, terminator line, core shadow? Those all exist for sure, and I'm sure you know about them. But remember, I'm taking you back to elementary school. Your ABCs, your 1, 2, 3s. And for lighting, this is your 1, 2, 3, your fundamentals, average light, halftone, and average shadow. Just these three values. So before you start snoring, note that this dividing line doesn't have to be in the middle. You can move it up, and an image in this value range would be considered high key. You can move it down, and likewise this would be considered a low key image. And you can even squeeze it down to a very close value range, and this is hard to do for sure in a real painting. But notice still that the order remains the same: average light, halftone, average shadow. That doesn't change, and that's the idea. For the same object, for the same local color, your lights are always lighter than your shadows. Okay, so now that we're all on the same baseline, let's dive right into some shading examples. We're going to go through a lot of examples in this video. Here's the first one. It's kind of a quick sketch from imagination. I didn't really know where I was going, but I eventually settled on kind of a midlife crisis race car driver. So I'm just going to speed through this drawing. Trust me, you're not missing much. I'll slow down for the main learning points and tips. You can see I do separate it out into a drawing stage and then a shading, adding in value afterwards. But you don't have to do it that way if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine to block in with big shapes with a big marker or a brush, and then draw the lines afterwards. That's a very legitimate way. So for me, even in this drawing stage, you can see I often flip the canvas and flip it often to catch any mistakes. Okay, now the drawing is done. Let's move on to the shading. Here, all I'm doing is duplicating the layer and changing the canvas size. And I'm doing this because I'm going to be doing two styles of shading on the same character. Now, when I'm thinking of a light source, I'm thinking about it in a 3D sense. So I like to represent it with a 3D arrow rather than just with a flat arrow. Because then, with a flat arrow, you're just losing out on information. Is the light coming from behind the character, on the same plane as the character, or in front? So I recommend thinking about this 3D arrow for a direct light source. Even drawing it out if you have to. For a lot of these black and white sketches, I like to use a light neutral tone background. So the reason is, think back to our average light, halftone, and average shadow. With a toned background, you can go lighter and darker right away. With just white paper, you can't really go lighter. You have to, fill it in first or just go around light areas. You'll see that in this sketch, I used the color of the paper as my average light for the skin. And the color of the paper is just going to be the average shadow for the tracksuit. So it just saves a little bit of time. It's not really required, but it's really convenient to set up in Clip Studio Paint. Now, I don't think you need a tutorial on how to change the color of your background paper. And if you do, it's just edit canvas properties. But what's nice is you can really easily save presets. If you're doing a bunch of value studies, for example, it's just when you're making a new file, you can choose your canvas size and your resolution and paper color. And the one I'm working on right now is a light tone gray, and you can see I already have that saved as a preset, but maybe it'll be fun to have a warm gray paper. So let's just change that, hit save, make sure paper color and resolution is checked, and just give it a name, warm tone paper. And that's it, it's really easy. Now if I just load up my new file, I can just select that and I'm good to go right away. Okay, let's slow down. Here I'm using a tone curve adjustment. And the reason I'm doing this is because I felt my halftones were too close to my shadows in value. Remember, the halftone is supposed to be part of the lights. So I'm going into Edit, Tonal Correction, and Tone Curve. And I'm on the RGB channel. What's shown here is a histogram of my values and an x-axis going from dark to light. So that little peak on the left probably represents all the dark pixels in the hair, and the peak on the far right is showing I have a lot of high value pixels in the jacket and the few highlights I added. And we also have a curve and a y-axis, which is the output, also going from dark to light. And when I'm playing around with the curve, my goal is to get my halftones closer to my light. So I'm grabbing the middle part of my curve where the halftones are and moving it upwards. And I'm also taking the lower part of the curve where my darks are and just making them slightly darker to get more separation between the lights and the darks. Next up, let's do the same picture but shade it in a hatching or ink method. Now, this is not a style that I'm normally used to, but it's always fun to try out and learn new things, so I want to share with you a few techniques that I learned during my studies. So the first thing I found helpful to me is to turn off the pressure settings for this pen tool. That's really easy. Just click right here by brush size and uncheck pen pressure if it's on. Now you don't have to do this again, but for this style I'm going for something similar to a graphic drawing, with a fine liner pen like in traditional media, and those pens have very consistent line weight. Now the next thing, and one of the most important things, is that notice that I'm shading my lines, I'm going around the form in the direction of the contours of the form. So if I shaded the entire shadow side of my face in the same direction, it would look very flat. And if you want it to look flat, then that's fine. But this is where, again, turn on your brain. You have to ask yourself, what kind of effect do you want with your shading? So let's slow down and take a look at the nose right here. Notice the lines on the side of the nose are going up, a different angle than the lines used to shade the cheek area right beside it. And you can go ahead and run your finger from your cheek to your nose. Yeah, go ahead and do it. And you'll feel the contour of your nose, as it protrudes out from your face. And wow, I have to wash my hands and face now. My face is very greasy. Okay, so you don't have to go in straight lines either. See right here on the neck, I'm drawing consistent curved lines. I'm thinking of the neck as a cylinder. And this part is also a good demonstration that just because we're drawing with lines now, we're shading with lines, we're not ignoring average light, halftone, shadow. There's no difference from the previous example on the left. Just now we have line. So how can we change up our value? Well, there's a few ways. So here on the neck, it's a good example. I'm using more lines, more closely packed lines to show the darker areas. Halftone, it gets less dense, and in the light, there's no lines there at all. A second way was to change up your line weight. So change the size of your pen and shade in with a thicker pen. You can see I'm doing that just to outline a few forms to make them more readable. Oftentimes you can see this outline on the silhouette of different drawings. But it's not just limited to this. You can also outline cast shadows, like right here on the right shoulder, and also highlights. You can see this in the hair, so that I remember not to shade in those parts. So the last technique I want to cover briefly is how to show gradations with just line. Well, I did this a little bit here on the left arm. One technique you can try is varying the length of your line as it goes towards the light. Start with a long line and gradually, you can even get to a dot. Okay, now we're just finishing it up, adding in some highlights with a white pen. And I noticed the hair should be a lot darker. So I just changed the line weight and I'm going over and shading that area again. And we are done. Okay, let's review these side by side. So we learned about the tone curves tool, talked about setting a preset for tone paper, and then we looked at pen shading techniques in Clip Studio Paint. Now I encourage you to try these for yourself, but before I do that, let me give you a quick warning. You know how I said to shade in the direction or contour of the form? Well, you know what else goes in the same direction as form? That's right, facial hair. All done. Now it's time to shade it in. Yay, make me pretty! Yay!
Am I pretty yet? Wait!
Okay, so the thing to be careful about is accidental facial hair. Now, it's not too bad. There's two things to realize. The first is that changing the direction of your shading influences the form. So if you do a quick change of direction, then it'll make a hard edge. Think of like a box. This was good here in this example because my character was rugged and boxy. You could see abrupt changes in direction all over, like the forehead, the chin, and the cheeks. So female characters in general will have softer forms, so you have to be more subtle. 2, this is more of a tip, but if you don't want your shading to be mistaken for facial hair, just be sure to use a different line weight for hair. Usually hair is darker anyways, or using a very thin line weight for pen shading when you're showing delicate forms. Now with that warning out of the way, let's compare the two. So both examples, it's clear that my lights are darker than my shadows. No matter what style you're shading in, it's critical to have a good understanding of lighting. That brings us to shape design. So in this graphic example, the shapes of my lights, halftone, and shadows are very clearly defined. I just outlined them. But even if you're doing a more realistic style, it's good to think about the shapes you're making when considering your lighting. Okay, here's the embarrassing moment. I did this practice face a few months ago. I was thinking of a bored kid with blue skylight shining in from the side on his face. But if we take a look at the values, I broke the order of average light, halftone, and shadow. The blue light here, it's darker in value than the halftone. That ruined the entire picture. Looking back at it now, it just looks like this kid fell down the stairs and got bruised on the left side of his face. So let's fix it up. Okay, so I'm really speeding through this one because there's nothing really new I can say. This one is in color, but I really want the main focus for this video to be about shading and shading techniques, mostly talking about value. Now that's all fixed, the rule was broken before, but now it looks like the light is actually hitting the side of his face. Even in this bit more realistic style, you can make sure that your shapes are well designed, usually simpler, even if they're broken up by softer edges. By the way, a quick tip, if you're working in color, you can always check the value of your artwork in Clip Studio Paint by clicking on your layer, going to Expression Color, and changing that to gray. Or, if you're the type that likes to work in layers, you can click this button here beside the layer menu, go to New Correction Layer, Hue, Saturation, Luminosity, and turning saturation all the way down. Now everything below this correction layer will be in grayscale. So that about wraps it up for this first part. 2 different styles to shade characters. Let's move on to part 2. So, what is atmospheric perspective? Well, it's good to explain with a picture. I took this photo from the Mori skyscraper when I was in Tokyo 2 years ago, and you can feel there's a lot of depth. The landscape stretches so far. The main reason you probably know is just perspective. Those buildings get smaller and smaller as they go in the back. But what else is happening here? Remember, we're talking about shading, so what do you think is happening to the value? So think about that for a second, and in the meantime, let's analyze this picture. I'm going to divide this up into foreground, midground, and background, and sample some colors from each section using the eyedropper tool. Okay, so I'm trying to get a range of different colors, different values. Notice anything yet? Maybe you've noticed the colors are getting cooler, more towards the blue. I mean, look at this red here. At least my brain thinks it's red. It's like a bluish purple, but it just reads as red. Anyways, let's focus on the value. If we include color, this video could be doubled in length, and I already feel like I dragged on way too long. Okay, hopefully you've thought about it. So take a look. So notice the values are narrowing so much as it gets into the background. Remember these pictures at the start? That's what's happening. The foreground would be like this picture, and the background would be more like this picture. As we're going back, there's less and less contrast. It's even clearer if we just look at the darkest object in this picture. So here's the value for the shadows in the trees in the foreground. So it's 14 here. Now let's take a look at the midground. And now further back. And even further back. So notice all the darks are getting lighter even though they still look dark. Now let's do a study of this picture. Maybe you're thinking, wow, Linko, you're going to study that? With all that complexity and detail? You're so amazing. Thank you, you're right. Just kidding. It's not going to be a good looking picture. I'm just studying it, and I want to achieve that depth that's happening, the atmospheric perspective, that shortening of valley. I want to see if I can capture that through shading with this study. So in Clip Studio Paint, one way you can study is just open up another image, like I'm doing here, and just drag it out of the page. This is useful if I'm doing a study or an original painting. I like to put the planning phase, thumbnail sketches, any notes on the second monitor, but for this demo, I'll just keep it on the same monitor. So here, I'm just laying out my big shapes with the Fill Lasso tool, just foreground, midground, background. And we know it's going to get lighter in the back, so the value range is going to shorten. In the foreground, I'm just going to draw lots of boxes and shapes with, a full range of value. And here in the midground, I'm just going to tighten my range, my value range. And again, lastly, in the back, I'm just tightening my value range even more. And the last thing you can do to add in atmospheric perspective is we can just soften some edges. I'm just using a basic soft airbrush because we're not going to see high definition crisp edges in the back. So you can see it might look like a mess. I told you it's not going to be a pretty picture. But if we zoom out enough in both images, you can see the impression of depth comes across. I had a goal just to show atmospheric perspective, and I think this study did that, so I consider it a success. Now, let's put everything we've learned and put it into one final example. So in this final example, we're going to be learning about two more useful tools in Clip Studio Paint, the gradient tool and the layer mask. We're also going to be combining what we learned from part 1. Remember how I showed you two different ways to shade a character? Well, I don't want you to think that you can only do one or the other. You can mix and match all kinds of styles, just do what suits you. People draw with pen and marker, pen and paint, all kinds of different media, all the time. So I started off with a 1-point perspective grid. I just did this with a special ruler in Clip Studio Paint. I'll link the documentation to that tool below, but it's not what I want to focus on. I had a lot of trouble with this sketch actually. I wanted to keep that all in for the video because, that's part of the process. And I'm actually in the process of learning perspective right now, so this was a great practice. I guess what I wanted to portray here is just a few people from a bunch of high up buildings looking outwards towards a beach and a distant city. And by the way, please let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow. I wanted to get through a lot of examples and cover a lot of points, but I also didn't want to bore people with, too much drawing process footage, so I apologize in advance. So I just wanted a bit more refined sketch this time. I'm just going over my rough sketch with the G Pen tool, pen pressure turned off, adding a few new details along the way. Now I use this in the last example, the Lasso Fill tool, and here I'm using it again, just filling in and separating the sky from my drawing. And I'm working with layers. So this is all on a multiply layer. so that when the gray tone multiplies with the line drawing underneath, the black line drawing still shows through. Now, here's the main part I want to focus on. I'm using the gradient tool to add in atmospheric perspective effects. This first gradient is from the sky, coloring it darker towards the camera at the top and white as it moves to the horizon. Now, next up, we can really easily modify the gradient tool to essentially give us a beam of fog, a beam of atmosphere. And it's really easy. I'll show you how to make it. So I'm going to that foreground to transparent gradient, and I'm duplicating that tool, and I'll just name it fog. Go and click on advanced settings, and on the gradient that shows up at the top, just click in the middle to add another point. Now what you want is for the points to be transparent on both ends and a color that you can pick in the middle. So when you put this down, there it is, beam of fog. Now obviously right now this looks really overblown, but you can see if we adjust the opacity of the fog and combining it with a layer mask, we can get some really interesting results. So this is the last tool we'll go over, the layer mask. And what this does is it'll allow us to erase our fog from the foreground. Why not just a regular eraser? Well, there's a few reasons. We can bring the fog back by painting transparently in the layer mask, so it's not permanently gone. We can also exactly see what we're erasing, which can be hard sometimes for something so soft like an airbrush or a gradient. Just right click your layer and hit show mask area and it'll come up in blue. Okay, so now I have to add in some atmospheric perspective to the beach below us. So I'm going to repeat the process, but this time I'm going to use a soft airbrush instead of a gradient. And again, I'll erase out the foreground. So I don't really know what I was thinking making the value so high there. I'll fix it later. Now here's another benefit for the layer mask. What we erased earlier is something that we can select. So that means I can be a bit messy with this airbrush for this beach and trees, because I can just go back to my layer mask, use the auto select tool, come back to the original layer, and just erase out the atmosphere in the foreground. So that's pretty convenient. I'm going to repeat the process for the rest of the painting, add in atmosphere effects with gradient or soft brushes, and adjust the level until I'm satisfied. Here I did much needed tone curve adjustment, really separating my foreground from the background, combining everything we've learned so far. So I'll finish up, finally decide on my light source, and start rendering the form of different objects. Okay, so that's all finished now. It was a nice study of shading atmospheric effects for landscapes. We covered a few concepts in this video and went over a few tools in Clip Studio Paint. Hope you learned something new. Thanks, and bye.